Another reading vlog today. This one isn't necessarily for a blog tour. I've gotten a blog tour for the sequel, so I'm reading the first book before I get into it. This read is Skin of the Sea by Natasha Bowen, so that I can read Soul of the Deep straight after. I didn't really know much about it other than it encompasses gods, mermaids, something like that. So yeah, it's a YA fantasy, and I don't really know much else about it, but I'm excited to get into it because I've heard some really good things, especially about Soul of the Deep. So I can't wait to get into it. Hey guys, so I'm only about 10% into Skin of the Sea, and I'm actually really liking it. It's set around the 15th century, and we're looking quite closely at the slave trade. We're following Simidele, who is a young woman who we can assume was on a slave ship and drowned. But rather than just dying, she is given the opportunity to become what's referred to as a mamiwata, which is essentially a mermaid who collects the souls of those that die at sea to be blessed and returned to the gods. And she's been doing this for several months. But unlike the other mamiwatas, she can't forget her previous life, even though when she's in mermaid form, those memories are taken from her. She only regains them when she's on land, which was interesting. Until one day, she sees a boy fall into the water, and from the manacles and chains about him, we can assume he was being taken captive to be a slave as well. But when she approaches him to take his soul, she realizes he's still alive and actually saves him, taking him to the goddess Yamoja's island, as it's the only landmass. And obviously he can't be in the water for very long like she can. And she saves him, not just from drowning, but she gets him food and water, helps take care of his wounds, because she doesn't believe that Yamoja would have her sit by and watch him drown when she could have saved him. But from the brief interaction we get between Simidele and Yamoja, the goddess is going to expect that. So now that the boy has demanded to see Yamoja and plead for her help in getting back home, it's going to come back and bite Simidele on the ass. Maybe literally, because there are quite a few sharks involved. But I can't wait to see where this goes. I'm a quarter of the way through The Skin of the Sea now, and I'm really enjoying it. So we've learnt that the boy who Simidele pulled out of the sea is Antigola, or Kola as she calls him. And they summon the Orisa, or goddess Yamoja, and she's furious and surprisingly terrified at what Simi has done. She explains that the Supreme Creator, when she created the Mamiwata, saw it as blurring the line between the Orisa and humans, because all of the Mamiwata were originally human and now they're not. And she faced a punishment for this, but he allowed the Mamiwata to continue to exist as long as they collected the souls of the dead and nothing else. And by rescuing Kola, she has broken this law that she didn't know existed, and she argues that point. But Yamoja tells her that she now has to go to the Supreme Creator and ask for clemency for what she has done. But she can't go through the messenger of the Orisa, Esu, because he is very corrupt, serves only himself. And if she goes through him, it will mean that all of the Mamiwata, including herself, will be killed. So she has to go find this person, shaman, called the Babalawa, who has 2 rings in his possession that will allow her to summon the Supreme Creator to ask for his forgiveness. And this Babalawa is, surprisingly, currently living very near Kola's village. So they are travelling together, and she has to stay in human form while they do this. Shortly after leaving, they run into a group of people who are very interesting and have their own agenda. But it also seems like the other Orisa are not happy with Yamoja's decision. And I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of issues in getting back to Kola's village. So I'm excited to see more of the other Mamiwata as they, travel along, more of the Orisa and their abilities, and just kind of learning more about our characters. But I'll check back in again around the halfway mark. And it's starting to get pretty interesting. It seems that Esu is aware of the journey that Simidele is making with Kola. They are helped along the way, and they do get back to Kola's village, Oko. And Simidele is worried because she's beginning to have visions about the earth dying and impending destruction and doom, as they do in these very overdramatic YA novels. But it isn't like that when they get back. But they do learn that Kola's twin brother and sister have been taken by Esu. And this is because, as far as I understand, they're like the twin Orisha reborn. So the Orisha or gods do seem to die and they get reborn. And the Babalawo, who they're seeking out, confirmed this and performed rites of protection, which I think is the only reason why the twins aren't dead and why Esu took them rather than killed them, because they're protected. But now they have to go to this Babalawo and find out A, about the rings, and if Esu has already got to them, and B, if he knows where Esu is, because he has the twins. So it seems that Simidele and Kola's journey is going to continue together for a little bit. But it's interesting to see, like, in YA, there typically seems to be conflict after conflict after conflict to keep the story moving. You know, first of all, it was Simi rescuing Kola, and then being sent on this mission to earn the forgiveness of the Supreme Creator, and a lot of stuff's happening along the way. Whereas in more adult fantasy, you know, think The Way of Kings, Out of the World, there's not that many conflict. There's a lot more focus on interpersonal relationships, world building, character development, and there can be times where it feels like nothing is happening. How do we move the story forward, etc. But it was a nice contrast. Quarters of the way through Skin of the Sea now, and I was kind of right about the very YA layout of the book, where they simply move from one conflict to the next. But we're getting a lot of character development, especially in regards to Simidele's backstory. And we're also getting a lot of the West African history, culture, language, religion, and a lot more, which can be daunting to some people. It was to me. Like, I typically tend to avoid books based on mythology if I'm not familiar with the mythology. So I will read a lot of books about Asian mythology because I'm very familiar with that. But I tend to avoid anything about cultures that I'm not familiar with, because I always think that I'm not going to understand things and that I'm going to be confused. But Bowen does a great job of using West African language and history and culture in his story and laying it out in a way that the reader doesn't have to be familiar with it to understand it, which was something I really enjoyed as a reader. Also, for YA, we are getting a lot on interpersonal relationships and histories, and it really is beginning to focus on the theme of loyalty. Like, what does it mean to be loyal? And I'm looking forward to seeing how it ends. And I have to say, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I did feel that it was a bit too fast paced, that there were certain things that could have been more in depth, like delving into some of the Orissa and Simideli's history. That would have been nice. It also would have been nice for her flashbacks of her past to have had more of an impact on the story rather than just fleshing out her character. You know, maybe if she'd come across someone who knew her from when she was human, that might have been a very interesting take. But the way it ended, I wasn't sure there was an opening for a second book. Like, it wraps up very nicely for me. You know, we have our main antagonist is defeated. We have a lot of character growth, a great final conflict scene, And we also don't get a romance. Like, the story builds this romance between Simideli and Adekola. But she is constantly reminded of the fact that he is human and she is not anymore. And that if anything was ever happen between them, it would unmake her. Because obviously, Umoja had to perform some sort of magic or something like that to remake Simideli from a human into a Mamiwata. And by her having any sort of romantic involvement with a mortal, it would undo that. So she would essentially die. And there's no getting around that unless she's made human again. And there are very few people, even among the Orissa, who have the power to do that. There were a few threads left for a second book, but unless the villain breaks free of his prison, which I doubt, because Simideli is definitely holding up her end of that bargain. I don't see what sort of conflict or anything could arise to push the book forward or give it a purpose. I just kind of felt this would have been a very nice standalone. So I'll have to see where book 2 goes.